Hello, everyone from All Things Open 2021. It's great to be here. Welcome to Community Repositories, why you need one for your open source project. I'm Rin Oliver. I use they, he pronouns, and I am a non-binary neurodivergent technical community builder at Camunda. Let's get started first with an introduction to community repositories. What are they? Why do you need one? Why should you have one? These are all questions that we're going to answer today here at All Things Open. You can think of a community repository as a map. It's a way for your new community members to get from point A to point B. They'll also have frequent destinations highlighted and points of interest noted. Slash community repositories, some must-haves look like a clear code of conduct, and more importantly, a resolution path. What happens if somebody has an issue? Where do they go if they have a problem? That should also be outlined in your slash community repository. Having a code of conduct is a good start, but also make sure that your maintainers and your community members that might encounter an issue know where to go or the path to escalation if they do encounter an issue. There should also be guidelines for getting started as a maintainer or a contributor. Those are really important to have so that people have those laid out and they're available so that you can make sure that your maintainers and your new and returning contributors have those best practices and those guidelines available to them so that they're available and easy to access so that that's all laid out. Another thing to keep in mind is your communication best practices. Not everyone communicates in the same way. Some people prefer to learn by reading. Some people prefer to learn by listening to something. Some people prefer to learn by reading documentation and getting started with the GitHub and GitLab docs and really digging into that code and the Git logs. So depending on how people like to learn, you've got to establish that your communication best practices set in mind that everyone has a different learning style and they all have a different communication style as well. So make sure that those are outlined and that you're holding space for people that communicate in different ways. Another thing to have in your slash community repo, of course, is your issue triage and security policies. How are people handling issues? Should they have labels? When do they expire? When do they go stale? Having that information available makes that issue triage process easier to define and easier to walk through for not only maintainers, but reviewers. So having those issues clearly labeled and making sure that everybody knows the process for how an issue goes from just being opened to actually being merged is critical. So another thing to have in your slash community repo is your security policies, whether that's just simply here's how we handle security alerts or your dependency management or making people aware of the tools that you'd like to use in your organization. Having those policies there is really key. So making sure that you have those security policies and your dependency management strategy outlined in your slash community repo so that your community members can access it is critical. Another thing is having a table of contents. Without a linked table of contents, people can find it really difficult to navigate a slash community repo. So making sure you have that table of contents with everything hyperlinked and that it's clear and quick to navigate is really key to making sure that everyone that comes to your community repo has a good experience when they're navigating it. So for those that might not be aware, creating a README in a slash community repository looks a little different from creating a standard README in your average repository. So we're going to walk through some ways to create a README for a slash community repo that will make that a better experience for those that are in your community. So this is an example of our README on the Camunda Community Hub, which is a project I started at Camunda. It is a central gathering place for all of our community extensions. And there are 121 extensions in our Community Hub as of today. And it's a centralized project to empower our open source community extension maintainers. It also encourages new contributors to get started contributing to Camunda open source, the Camunda open source ecosystem. And it really lays out that whole getting started experience. As you can see, we have a clearly defined table of contents that lays out not only what the Community Hub is, why you should migrate there, how to get started, that issue triage policy, expectations for both maintainers and reviewers, how you should identify a maintainer, because sometimes it's difficult to figure out who a maintainer actually is, and also ways to handle automated releases, security policies, and how to write a solid README. So having that information available means that you're better able to have a community repository README that not only meets the needs of your community, but also exceeds them. Having this information there means that you are more able to not only improve that developer experience, but improve the maintainer experience and your new contributor experience. But the key thing to remember is to keep that timeline realistic. When I first started the Camunda Community Hub, I had started that proposal back in January of 2021. And we actually got to the point of rolling out the Community Hub in its entirety in October. So that was a 9-month timeline. You might think that documentation and these sort of policies and READMEs, et cetera, are very quick to draft, and that is incorrect. Keeping your timeline realistic for these is very important. In February, I began building out the Community Hub and invited our first round of projects. And by March, that first round of projects had migrated. And in April, we started migrating the second round of projects. And then in May and June, we started scoping our automated release and security tooling guidelines, but we didn't have those guidelines actually finished until September. So again, it's all about keeping those timelines realistic. You should start your project with the idea in mind that it will take longer than you anticipate. Keeping these timelines realistic means that everyone is on the same page and that no one expects that things will be completed in a rather short amount of time. That gives you time to draft the best version of your policies, the best version of your getting started guides, and the best version of all of your projects, and making sure that all of your maintainers have what they need to access your community repo successfully. Now, you might be wondering what the difference is between a contributor guide and a community repository. While these are very similar things, they are in fact different. A contributor guide often explains to new contributors how to get started with a project. And it's a great way to get people up to speed. It lets them know how to contribute, etc. What they need, any prerequisites, do they need to install something? Do they need to download a demo? What do they need in their stack before they actually make that first pull request? Another thing that a contributor guide has is a style guide for formatting code, and it explains your first contribution and usually walks you through how to make that first one. So that's really important to have in your contributor guide. A community repository, on the other hand, has your maintainer best practices, has your contributor best practices. It usually has your security policy, how-tos, communication guidelines, and a whole lot more. So your community repository is a place to not only get contributors up to speed, but it also lays out those best practices, policies, communication guidelines, and everything else that people will need when they come to your GitHub organization or GitLab organization for your community projects in the open source ecosystem. The key thing to remember is progress, not perfection. So if you go to github.com and visit the Camunda-community-hub/community, you'll notice that that repository is far from perfect. That's okay. It's a work in progress and it's created in the open. So having that created in the open means that we're able to not only get feedback from maintainers and our community members, but we can get feedback from fellow Camunda employees as well. And striving for having that README perfect can really hurt your progress. It means that you're not able to iterate as quickly, and it means that you're missing out on valuable feedback. Even a small amount of up-to-date documentation is better than having no documentation. So in the end, that's the key thing to remember, is that something is better than nothing. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to exist. So you've also got to remember that creating a welcoming community is a never-ending rewarding process. And to make sure that you have those policies in place to create a welcoming community starts with your /community repo, because that will lay out your communication guidelines, it lays out your code of conduct, and it makes sure that everybody that's in your community and in your GitHub organization feels welcome and knows how to contribute and knows the ways to get around that sphere and contribute in a way that is meaningful to them. So community repositories provide different things depending on where you sit in your community, and that's okay. So starting with your community repository, this can branch off in different ways depending on whether you're a contributor or a maintainer. So this looks like, for contributors, it starts out with a roadmap. That's what the community repository basically is. Think of it as a map. It gets you from point A to point B, and it provides you valuable destinations that you'll find along the way. It lays out your key points that you're going to want to hit when you're there. And it also has key information that you're going to need to navigate that project successfully. So if you're sitting at a GitHub organization like the Camunda Community Hub with 121 community extensions in it, and there was no /community repo, that's a lot of extensions. You're not going to know where to go, and you're going to be looking around kind of lost. But since you have the /community repository, we've made sure that people have a nice starting point and they can kick off their journey getting started with the Camunda open source ecosystem and our projects there successfully because they have that roadmap in place with that /community repo. For maintainers, what it does is it gives them guidelines about pull request review. It gives them guidelines on how to respond to issues. It gives them guidelines on how to select reviewers. It also establishes those best practices for things like integrating CI/CD, automated testing, security, all of those wonderful things that maintainers need to do their projects in a way that is successful to them and it makes their lives easier. So by having that community repository, it lays out, here's what you need to do as a maintainer to have a wonderful experience here. And it gives them the tools they need to get started quickly and to make sure that they don't have any bumps in the road while they're, for example, migrating a project over into your GitHub organization, or they're creating a brand new one. So having a community repository is really critical in that it's a centralized place for everyone to find what they need that could be involved in your community in some way. So let's say you've already got that community repository. Now what? What do you do with it? It's wonderful, it exists, but without a why, you're not going to get very far. You've got to find out what that why is. If you need a starting point, a good one to start is a commitment to having an improved community and developer experience. That's a good reason to create a community repository. Another thing to remember is to keep it open. All Things Open is an open source conference, and we strive for open source in the community hub. So by keeping your /community repository in the open and developing it with open source best practices and policies in mind, you're not only going to allow your community to provide you more transparent feedback in real time, you're going to allow individuals from all backgrounds to contribute to that. You're going to make sure that people that come from backgrounds that might not be strictly a computer science background can contribute. For example, I myself have a public relations degree. So I come from a non-traditional tech background. And by having a community repository and having the opportunity to contribute to documentation and to contribute to communication guidelines, et cetera, these projects open the door for people such as myself to contribute without having to write code. It levels the playing field and it makes sure that everyone that wants to contribute can contribute to your project. Another thing to remember is that you should document everything. By having detailed, concise documentation and communication guidelines, you enable, like I said, everyone from all backgrounds to contribute to your project. So having documentation is key, and making sure that your documentation is well established and it really lays out how people communicate, because like I said earlier, for those of you that were not here, not everyone communicates in the same way. You've got to remember that some people learn by listening, some people learn by reading, some people learn by getting hands-on and really digging into something and how it works. They want to take it apart and put it back together. So by having documentation available in multiple formats, you're able to better access that for everyone that joins your community, not just people that are strictly writing code and only learn in a particular way. So making that a welcoming space that allows for people with all learning backgrounds and all levels of expertise is critical. Having a community repository means that your community in the overall scheme of things wins, which is really important. So everybody loves to win. And even if you don't, you still like to have fun and you still like to feel like you've contributed to something meaningful. So having a community repository not only enables your community members to find the solutions they need quickly, it also lets them access new projects that they might not have known existed. And it also lets them build new solutions that are creative to new and existing challenges that they might face in your particular tech stack. So for example, in the community hub, we have projects that extend Camunda in some way for a variety of different aspects of our platforms. So this can look any number of ways for your community, depending on what your /community repo has in it and what your GitHub organization is intended to house. So if it's a bunch of open source projects, then that community repository will lead people to build projects that will not only extend your base product, but it will spiral on beyond that. And you'll see things create ripples and create more new exciting things that you never even thought were possible, which is really great. So having a community repo sets up a lot of wins and a lot of opportunity for your community to get excited and get involved to contribute to open source software. A little roadmap about this. It can look a little different for everybody, but your first step should be clearly start your GitHub or GitLab organization. Make sure that you've got that all set up. And everybody on your team that needs to has those credentials and can get in there and can make those changes. And then you've got to decide, of course, what needs to be in that repository. That can look different depending on what you have in your community and what that community repository's end goal is. So get together with your team, ask what are the key things that we want to be in this community repo? What do we want people to immediately learn when they come here? The key thing is to make sure that you're highlighting that entire journey and that everyone has what they need to do what they do best, whether it's maintainers or contributors. Another thing that you need to do, of course, in the middle of the road is begin drafting your documentation. Make sure that it looks the way you want it to look. Make sure that you've offered recordings of the documentation in an audio format or a video format and post those online if you have the capabilities to do so. And if not, consider put a pin in it for a later date. Having that available in multiple formats is really important. So I highly recommend that your documentation not just live as something someone can read. I highly recommend making it interactive and able to be digested in a multiple ways that you could consume information. So next on that roadmap, you should probably start adding that documentation to your community repository. That's where the fun starts. Start making those pull requests, merge them, get your team involved, make sure that everybody's got those documentation pages going and that you're really building out that community repo to be what you wanted it to be when you first started that project. And then of course you got to tell people about it. So publicize it, get that /community repo out into your community, post it on Twitter, hashtag open source, make sure that people know it exists. This is where you go to get started in our open source community. Here's what you'll find here. Shout about it from the rooftops, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, you name it, even TikTok, whatever your social media is of choice, make sure that people know you have a community repo because that's their getting started point. That is their true north on the compass. That is where they're going to find everything they need. And then of course, you should not only encourage those new contributors, you should also maintain that contributor growth for your existing contributors. And you should also ensure that everyone that's in your community is sticking around. And even if they're not, just make sure that they're still having a good experience. Even if they only make one contribution, that's one more contribution than you had. So be sure to thank your new contributors, make sure that you're checking up with your maintainers, ask what they need, ask if they're finding everything or what you could improve, and make sure that community repo is revisited and continuously improved because that's how you make it better in the long run. And of course, where's your community going to go? Anywhere, really. It's up to you. Well, you can start small, you can end up big. In January, the Camunda Community Hub didn't even exist. It had 0 repositories. Now it has 121. That's pretty cool. So we've gone a long way with that at Camunda, and I hope that inspires you to build a community repo and see what kind of projects you can get in your GitHub organization, because the sky's the limit. This process might be a little daunting, but that's okay. Don't worry. No need to panic. If you remember to find out your why and really remember why we want this community repo to exist, involve your community and get those best practices down, that's your first step. And that's the key. Just get started. It doesn't have to be beautiful. You just have to start. That's very important to remember. Don't be perfect. Just has to be there. Starting with something is better than having nothing. Another thing to remember, of course, in the spirit of open source is to keep it transparent, keep it open. Working in the open to create a living /community repo with your community, you're able to not only understand the needs of that community and hear their feedback, but you're able to improve not only the developer experience for those working with your product and your services, but the experience for the maintainers that are helping to build out those extensions, those community pieces, etc. You're helping not only your core product users, but the maintainers that are building out your product to make it better in some way in the open source community. And then of course, the last step there is continuous improvement, which is very important. So revisiting, revising, and improving your /community repo over time and ensures that your documentation remains up to date. Those policies and those procedures can continue to improve because you as a person will continue to learn new things every day. And you should bring that back, bring back what you've learned at events like this, bring back what you learn throughout this industry and use it to make that /community repository better. Use it to improve what you have and use it to continuously improve to make that community repo a place where not only people want to contribute, but where people say, this is a good example of how to get started in open source. So to recap, for those that joined us a little late, we're going to go over the things that we talked about earlier in this presentation. First things first, like I said earlier, find that why. What motivates you? What's got you really excited to create that community repo? What are you hoping to bring to your community and your open source community and those maintainers and those contributors? Why do you want this to exist? When you find that, get started by welcoming those contributors. Having a welcoming community for those from all backgrounds is key. And if you want, you can even automate this. I prefer to go the human way and say, and welcome new contributors with an actual person, but you can use bots if you'd like. There's GitHub Actions for this. They exist, and they're pretty awesome if you've got a really large community already. Automate it if you need to. Never be ashamed of that. It takes a lot of load off maintainers. So especially if you have a much larger project that's really growing rapidly at scale, never be afraid to automate. Use GitHub Actions. Use the tools that are available to you and make sure that you've got automation where you need it and that you consider where you should have a more personal touch. That's really important too. Another thing, of course, is working in the open. Open source creates not only a stronger community and a better developer experience, but it improves your documentation. And it allows for not only quick feedback, but it allows for collaborative communication process. And it allows for people that communicate in different ways to get their ideas heard by communicating in the open. You can have Zoom calls, you can have issue triage burn downs, you can have a variety of things that let you create work out in the open and contributing to open source. And by having a community repo, you're not only having maintainers in there, but you have people from documentation backgrounds, people from communication backgrounds, and you've really marketing background, you've leveled that playing field. So it's not just pure code, which is really important because that creates a better industry for all of us. And setting those expectations, it's pretty simple. If you didn't document it, it's a nice idea, not a process. So write it down. Very important to set those expectations clearly and make sure they are documented so you can point to that section in your documentation and tell people where to go for that piece of information. Another thing, of course, is best practices. Without best practices, you're going to have a lot of people that are kind of lost. So having your best practices and your key things documented for those contributors and those maintainers is key. Make sure that they know what you'd prefer them to do from the start. What's their main thing? Without best practices, they're not going to know. So have those listed and make sure that they have those key guidelines in place and so that they know what's expected of them and everybody's on the same page. Continuous improvement, again, huge. If you create a /community repository and for lack of a better term, throw it over the wall and never update it, it's just a nice thing to read. But you've got to keep coming back to it. You've got to improve it over time. It's nice to have it, but if you're never looking at it, that's a whole different story. You've got to go back to these things and you've got to make sure that they're continuously updated and continuously improved. That's really important, is to make sure that you're revisiting that and saying, what have I learned recently that I can add to the /community repo so that our community is having a better experience? I would like to thank you all. And if you have any questions, you can find me at Kiran Oliver on Twitter and at Slant on GitHub. And I am happy to take questions in the time that we have left remaining, if anybody has any. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. If nobody has any questions, I'm happy to open up a roundtable for people to chat too. No worries. Yes.
I don't really have a question.
Okay.
But I want to say we also have a community repository.
Yes.
And we also have a community handbook.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have 2 places where we cover many of the things that we talked about. Right?
Mm-hmm.
From our experience, it's been really good to reflect on the community and actually start to write down how we're doing things and how, how can we ask? I think that's something that I took away from your talk.
Absolutely. I think that's really important, having that and being able to pass on that torch. It's about growing maintainers and making sure that there's not only processes for getting new contributors, but for getting people up that contributor ladder. And that community repo should ideally have that contributor journey mapped out so that people know they can start as a contributor, but they can end up a maintainer. And they should have that journey outlined there so that they know the steps in place to take. So having that roadmap in place, say you can start as a maintainer, you can start as a contributor, you can end up a maintainer, you can go to a reviewer, etc. However that looks for you, you should ideally have that laid out, and that way they can see themselves in that journey. And if you have people that are more advanced in your community that you'd like to mentor these new contributors and to get them along that path to becoming reviewers and then becoming maintainers and growing the next generation of open source contributors, that's key too. So set up some mentoring hours, set up an office hour and say, we're going to have an hour dedicated to issue triage. And if you're interested in becoming a reviewer, if you're interested in becoming a maintainer, join us, come hang out with us on Zoom. We're going to do some issue burn downs and we'd love to have you there. I hope that helps. All right. Beautiful. Beautiful. All right. Well, I thank you all. Yes. No, you're fine. All good. Hmm. Perfect. Hmm. Right. I really enjoy GitHub and I see it as one of the main places to go, but I will say that GitLab is really cool too. They are they're both wonderful tools in their own right. It really depends on where your organization is wanting to go. I prefer GitHub personally, but I have no complaints against GitLab. They both do very, very, very similar things, and some things better than others. It really depends on your particular use case, and depends on where you'd like to sit in your tech stack. I like GitHub because I use a lot of GitHub Actions, and GitLab has GitLab Runners on the other hand. So they both, like I said, they do similar things, and it just depends on where you'd like your project to go. I see a lot of nonprofits using GitHub. I see a lot of them using GitLab. It really just depends on your community. And that's where I would encourage you to research what others in your sphere are doing. Where are they hosting their community repos? Where are they hosting their code? And do a quick audit of the top 5 projects in your sphere and say, okay, these 5 are using GitHub, these 5 are using GitLab, or these 6 are using GitHub, and these 3 are using GitLab, however that shakes out, and then make a decision from there and compare and contrast those features to make sure that you've got the best experience for your community. I hope that helps. Cool. Awesome. Beautiful. Well, I thank you all for joining me, and I am going to end it here. And if anybody has any questions, you can find me upstairs at the Camunda booths. I am at booth 45 and 46, and I will be here all week. Thank you so much.